Well, friends, welcome back to the Space for Faith podcast. My name's Mike Goldsworthy, and it is good to have you joining us today. I am grateful that you're here, and I am joined today with my friend Keri Ladouceur, who's coming to us all the way from Raleigh, North Carolina. And Keri, I don't think we have gotten to have you on here for anything yet, have we?
No, I don't think we've had any conversations on here. Lots of conversations elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, we have talked about having you on here, and we'll have you on here for, I think we need to have a different kind of conversation, what we're going to do today, another time. So it'd be good to have you on here another time. And for folks who don't know, Keri is the executive director of the Post-Evangelical Collective. And a part of the conversation that I want us to have today stemmed from she and I were both recently in Washington, D.C., with an organization that we both love and are engaged with called Telos. Does work in places of intractable conflict around the world, around peacemaking, and specifically around the Israel-Palestine conflict and the war in Gaza. We're there around all of that. And I wanted to bring some resources here for folks to be thinking about wrestling through and realize Keri has already done a bunch of podcast episodes with some great interviews. And so what I want to do is she and I are going to chat for a little bit, but a part of what I'm doing here is we're going to highlight one of the episodes that she did, an interview with a friend of ours named Greg Khalil, who's one of the co-founders of Telos. And I want to point you towards the great things that she's putting out that I realize I don't have to reduplicate this work. And so I want to point you towards her stuff. So all of that really long introduction to say, hi, Keri, thanks for being here.
Hey, Mike, thank you so much for having me. And I'm just thrilled that you're leaning into this conversation and that we get to talk about it here together. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, hey, I know you have been engaged with Telos way longer than I have. And I'm kind of curious, what spurred that on for you? What did that, what sort of began to draw you to engage with this organization that at the time was primarily focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Yes, I didn't realize I had been engaged with them longer than you, but my journey, I got invited on a trip, 13 years ago, and I was actually 12 years ago, I was pregnant with my son, and I couldn't go, and I was really interested in why we were going, why we were taking leaders on this trip at the church that I worked at. So I started doing a little kind of pre-reading and pre-work, and then went on a trip, like an immersive experience in the Holy Land with a group of leaders. And it was more than I ever imagined, that particular experience. It was really eye-opening in ways I had no idea what I was stepping into. It was really confronting in ways that as I went on this experience, we spent time with people on all sides of the conflict, if you will, which is more than just two sides. And I felt like it was revealing to me of the implications of my theology here over there. I couldn't unsee after this experience how tethered we were to the actual realities of the conflict that were playing out and the consequences and implications of those. And so in a lot of ways, it was almost like a conversion experience. I came back and it had opened up a lot of things for me where I really had to wrestle with the implications of my theology, life and death implications. And so in some ways, it catalyzed a whole journey for me, both forming me in the capacity to have complexity and hold a dual narrative or a multiple narrative, and really revealing and challenging me on the implications of my theology and what I believe and what I contribute to and the consequences of things I contribute to. So it was a really eye-opening, unearthing experience for me in a lot of ways. And then I engaged with them organizationally since then in several ways. I served on the board for a while. I took several delegations of leaders there, and then also helped explore trips in other continents, post-apartheid reconciliation work in South Africa, leader training trips for the on-the-ground trips and the experience in Israel, Palestine, that type of stuff. So I've just gotten to volunteer with them for the last 12 years or so since that first engagement.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've been way more engaged than I have. And I think one of the things that's happened, so my engagement actually started in 2018, so significantly newer than yours. And what spurred it on for me was when the president at the time, Trump, had moved our embassy into Jerusalem, and it was such a big deal. And I was like, I actually don't understand why this is a big deal. And through a mutual friend, got in touch with Todd Deathridge, one of the co-founders of Telos, who talked to me, like helped give me some situational context for it, some historical context for it, and then invited me to go with him out there to experience on the ground where you are experiencing competing narratives about the reality of what's happened. And then you're having to sit with these competing narratives. And I think in the moment that we're in right now, October 7th happens, where there's this horrific attack that Hamas does on Israel, takes all these folks captive, which then begins this horrific war against Palestinians in Gaza.
Yeah.
And for a lot of folks, in the same way that, like, when the embassy was moved and I didn't have a lot of context for it, and I knew this was a big deal, but I don't understand why all it's a big deal. I think that's what happened with October 7th for a lot of folks is like, okay, I know that there's conflict there. I have some pieces of the story, but I don't have a larger sort of like framework for that.
Yes.
So
Yes.
you were coming in, though, to October 7th, into the war that's come after that, with a bit of years of experience of that, of on the ground experience of that, and engaging in it. So I'm kind of curious, like, what were you experiencing, seeing, and finding yourself talking with people about to try
Yeah.
to help give some of that larger narrative context and make sense of it?
Yes. Well, I mean, I'll just be really honest. At first, I had to wrestle through my own like anger and grief and frustration about what we were watching play out. And then I think I, in some ways, was relieved at the disillusionment that people started to name. Like, I really, for the last 10 years, as this has been part of my own journey of formation and reckoning, and it was a big part of my sort of deconstruction and reconstruction of my own faith paradigm and my own understanding of the gospel and of theology. I took, coaching from Greg and Todd, the co-founders of this organization, and I just in opportunities began to tell stories or make references, or when I was teaching at churches, sometimes my experiences in the Holy Land would come up because it was so formational for me. And I actually started hearing from Christians all over at churches I had worked at or served at or taught at, some even friends that won't identify as Christian anymore, but they were saying, I have so many questions. It feels so complex. I don't understand what's happening. I don't understand our unfettered allegiance and alignment with Israel. I don't even know where I can ask the questions. And many of them said it feels so uncomfortable or so awkward, like I'm going to get it wrong even in the questions. So how can I learn? Like, what resources can you point me to? So Telos, of course, is a resource that I point people to, but there's more than is just their work, because there's historical implications, there's political implications, there's theological implications. The thing I wrestled with most is how integrated the church, the witness of the church in the West, is with what's playing out in Israel Palestine, what has been for decades, and what in this moment is playing out. And so that was my own sort of complicity that I was wrestling with. It's why I had talked about it over the years. So I felt like, okay, I can't take all these people that I love so dearly to the land to understand. We don't have the luxury of that experience. How can I expose them to at least some pieces of the complexity and ways that they may not otherwise be exposed to in the news or on social media? And is there a way that we could create some space that we can learn and dive into these topics more so than just the political rhetoric that's playing out? I think many people, even my neighbors, when we talk with us that aren't Christians, feel really implicated in what's happening. And that's a reality. We are participating. And those of us that call ourselves followers of Jesus, I think, have a real invitation in this moment to discern how are we to steward our influence on behalf of the marginalized. And what Telos taught me is that there's no solution that's a solution for one party and not a solution for both parties. And so I find that sort of work is the most challenging for many of us. We love the binary, black and white, cut and dry. Nothing about this is that way. But that's, if I have to be certain about one thing, it's that if there's not dignity and agency and safety for both people groups being impacted right now, that's not offered to either of them. I'll pause there.
Okay.
But those were the conversations. And that's why I started this like meager thing of a podcast where we're just having some of these conversations publicly for people who want to dive in more.
Yeah. Well, let's even let's name your podcast, but so we don't forget to do it. I'll put it in the
Yeah.
show notes too. I'll link it over there. But what's it
Sure.
called?
It's called A Third Way, and we've talked about topics for the last several years that I was wrestling with other, mostly church leaders were facing. It was kind of the Nicodemus in the night behind closed doors conversations. And so I hadn't done it in a while, but when this moment presented itself, I had to find a way to put these conversations in the world. So it's sort of a new season called Mutuality in the Middle East, A Third Way, Mutuality in the Middle
I
East.
love it. Well, and that word mutuality I know has become really important in the way that like we think about what's happening there. You talked about the idea that like you can't have a solution for one without having a solution for the other. We've got to move past kind of binary thinking around this. And even like one of the things that I've found in the ways that when I've engaged with folks on this, that you have one side that's like Israel is totally justified in everything that it's doing. And of course, everything it's doing is good and right. We've got to stand with them. And then I'll be with another side that's just like F Israel and
Mhm.
and F anyone that's supporting Israel. And
Yeah.
it all does feel very binary. So like would you talk a little bit about the idea of like what does mutuality mean? What have we learned about that here? Why do we care about that?
Yeah. Uh, the first reason that I wanted to engage in these conversations is because this is the moment that we have to. They're because of the lives being lost, because of the devastation that I perceive now for generations, we will feel the reverberations of this moment. And secondarily, I can't unsee how much what's happening there and this ongoing retributive conflict is such a reflection to our own souls and systems and structures. Uh, the Israeli people have experienced atrocities unimaginable. Like it is not that distant memory to talk about the Holocaust. And so this deep-seated need to protect and defend at all costs can make sense when you talk about that sort of devastation and harm. It's an atrocity beyond my imagination. And I've been to the Holocaust Museum, in the Middle East. It is more than we can fathom. And so it's understandable now, this need and desire to defect or to protect and defend and to advocate for safety. And I guess I know a little bit too much about some of the political implications, how none of this was a surprise. What happened on October 7th, ways that the state of Israel has funded Hamas in order to keep separate political parties amongst the Palestinian people. I mean, there's so much sort of baked into this moment, but to recognize there's not a solution that's good for Israeli people that is harmful to the Palestinian people, and vice versa. Our imagination is way too small if retribution is that. So while I can understand what has happened to get to this moment, to defend and protect and pursue safety, it's not anti-Semitic to say committing the exact same atrocities on a different people group. And I think that we're at to the place, I just want to give a little bit of a trigger warning with the language, like ethnic cleansing or genocide. There are countries that have gone to court to say what is happening right now violates international law. It is a humanitarian crisis. And so our imaginations are too small to think that that's the way to get to safety for this people group, is to obliterate this people group. And I can't unsee how this is precisely what we do to one another. When we don't heal our wounds, when we're unaware of the trauma or the pain of our own story, the way that it then plays out in retributive ways, and we live in reactivity. And I think that what's happening there is a microcosm of that in this moment.
Gosh, there's so many more things I want to ask you about, but I want us to keep it kind of shorter because I want to be able to jump into your podcast here, and for folks
Sure.
to get to hear it. So before we set it up, was there anything that you feel like we're missing that would be helpful as we have some context for jumping into these conversations that you've been having with others?
I would say there's a lot to excavate. Our own theological paradigms that come into this. Certainly, there's history, there's political ramifications to what's happening. And I think the way of Jesus, for those of us that are Jesus followers, are invited to have imaginations for what mutuality and flourishing look like, and to reckon with the idea that that flourishing doesn't exist for me if it doesn't also exist for you. If my flourishing comes at the cost of your flourishing, that's not flourishing. And I think we in this moment and beyond, have the opportunity to have a much bigger imagination for what the gospel is, and is the gospel good news, and who is it good news for? And when we look at God's original intentions for creation, for shalom, for goodness, for flourishing, for generative ways of being with one another and with the land, for reciprocative ways, I think we have an invitation to have much bigger imaginations for restorative justice than just what is retributive. So I would say be prepared to excavate all of the dynamics that you're bringing into this moment of crisis. And I hope that the amount of the ways that we're socialized and cultured and formed, I hope that doesn't impede taking action in this moment. Yeah, that's what I want to say.
It's great. Okay, well, just real practically, give us a quick overview on like what are some of the conversations. We're gonna play one with you with Greg Khalil. We'll set that up in a second. But what are some of the other conversations that you've had that folks could tune into around this particularly?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that many Christians that I was hearing from didn't understand the church's alignment with being pro-Israel, or the eschatological lens that people had on this moment. And so they were trying to understand, because there is rhetoric out there that really bastardizes and co-ops. And I think part of what hinders us entering into that conversation is our own colonized version of faith that we hold here in the West. So I had a conversation with a Bible scholar, Scott McKnight, talking about just what are some of the things that go into that reading of the text. What are some of the things that go into like rapture or replacement theology, those types of things. I have a conversation with Drew Jackson, who is like a poet, prophet, pastor, works for the Center of Action and Contemplation, and writes some poetic commentaries on the book of Luke from the underside. What does this say about the kingdom of God? And I think he has a pretty profound challenge for us. I speak with the woman, Michelle Graham, who I've gone on some trips with. She did her MDiv thesis work around the difference between geopolitical Israel and theological Israel, and talks about some of the covenants that supersede other covenants. So kind of helps us reckon with what we do with the land and who it belongs to. I talked to Jason Miller, who's a pastor and has experience on the ground, and also talks about his journey of sort of reckoning and how that shapes, what he believes, what he does in the church world. Another Bible scholar named Cody. It's not done. We're going to continue to add conversations. I've got one coming up with a mutual friend of ours who's a pastor, long time. He just retired from local church ministry, but he changed his mind on this topic while leading a congregation. And so he's just going to talk about even his own journey of discovery and exploration. So Palestinian Christians, and then Greg, that's the episode you're going to share, where I think he unpacks in a variety of ways what's happening. He was a lawyer on the ground negotiating the peace deal for Palestinians and on Gaza 20 years ago, and talks about how much this moment was not a surprise. And he's just a brilliant thinker and really challenges us in that conversation. So I'm thrilled that you're going to share that one.
So good. Thanks for letting us share it here. And again, I'm going to point folks, I'll put links in the show notes to these other podcasts that friends, I want you to be paying attention over there. There's no reason I need to be having those conversations, because Keri's already doing a great job having some great folks. And I'd really encourage you to have some curiosity here, to think about what it looks like for you to engage and to take some next steps in your own life, to care about what's happening in this place, because flourishing for you is deeply and interconnected into flourishing for others. And so it matters.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing it, Mike. I look forward to some feedback.
Thanks, Keri.
Hey, Greg Khalil, thank you so much for being willing to join me for this really important conversation. I'm excited to introduce you to so many friends who I hope are tuning in for this. I would start by saying you're somebody I have learned more about the world from than maybe anyone else in my life. I'm grateful for your perspective, and I'll introduce you as one of the co-founders of Telos, an organization that's engaged in the Middle East, but I know you have a lot more history invested than just that. Would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, first, Keri, I have grown so much because of our friendship as well. So it's really humbling to hear those words from you. And I see you as an incredible mentor and a trailblazer in a world where we need more prophets with feet. So like you're walking the walk, and I'm just really honored to be part of this conversation. Um, yeah, well, I mean, what would you like to know? I was born and raised in San Diego, Palestinian dad, Christian, Palestinian Christian dad, Danish mom. My dad actually, I love to tell the story, was born 500 feet from from where Jesus was born, in a town called Beit Sahur, Shepherd's Field in the Bible, just adjacent to Bethlehem. And he was born on Orthodox Christmas, so in a one-room stone house that was built by my great-grandfather's grandfather.
Mm.
That stone house was in the style of homes since Jesus's time. So there was a lower area open to above where people lived upstairs, and downstairs was the actual manger, and there were animals there when my dad grew up and was born in the house. So my grandmother, Fahima, um, who was devout Christian, um, because of the auspicious date of his birth, named him Isa, which is Jesus in Arabic. So Jesus born in Bethlehem on Christmas, and kids when I was growing up would tease me and call me son of Jesus. So yeah, but little joke.
I
But
love it. I love it.
that's the beginning.
I had the privilege of meeting your dad a couple different times and going to Bethlehem with him. Is that
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
that was like I think you were at his 90th birthday party.
Yes, yes, one of the trips there. An incredible man who is much like Jesus, who I'm sure has formed you, and we get to benefit from what he's invested in you as well. I'm grateful for him.
Well, those are kind words, but what it meant for me growing up is that I had this irreconcilable tension. Since I was born in San Diego, he was born there. He was one of 10 siblings. And so I had about, literally about 100 first cousins, and many more, counting their kids and grandkids. And they lived there. But growing up in San Diego, I had every opportunity as an American, right? I had anything I wanted to do was a possibility.
Mhm.
Didn't mean it was going to be easy, but then I had all my cousins over there who we'd speak to on the phone, every week, every month, and their reality was totally different. It was like they didn't necessarily have running water. They were every bit as ambitious, as talented, same humor, same allergies, like same me. Just the only difference was the accident of the place of our birth. And so it really put this deep sort of disjunct in my soul from my childhood. How do I resolve these two things? How is it that my own family could have this reality, and I'm stuck here? And it put it in sharper distinction because many people who are listening may not be familiar with the history or the realities in Israel Palestine. And those history and that history and those realities are really important. And in my view, then as it is today, like America has we've authored a lot of the horrors on the ground that we see for both Israelis and Palestinians, and in particular, American Christians
Mhm.
have been the author of this. So I joked about me, not all American Christians, some. I just want to be clear. There's a variety of American Christian responses, but we can talk more about this. But some theologies have really supported really terrible realities that impact people on the ground. And growing up Palestinian Christian in America, like I joke, but it's not a joke. People will often ask, like, "Wait, you're Christian? When did you convert?" Like, 2,000 years ago. When did you convert? They don't understand that the oldest Christian community in the world is in Palestine. Bethlehem
Mhm.
was the birthplace of Jesus, who was a heretical rabbi, Jewish, who what was the prophesied Messiah, for as Christians believe. But the very first believers, according to Act 2, are there. And this was just something that really tore at me growing up, that like, wait a second, how is it that I can be Christian in America. And here's my family there who passed this faith down from generation to generation under empire after empire, occupation after occupation. So all these people who claim to love Jesus, like have this faith here, it doesn't make us, my family, any better than anyone else. But like, how is it that these folks are like actually opposed to people living on the ground, and in my view, don't even resemble the basic teachings of Jesus? And so that really put like this fire in me that like I had to do something about it. I had a responsibility because I had agency. Like I couldn't just sit back and like not do and not say anything. And later in life, that resulted in me becoming a lawyer. And I my first job out of law school actually was on the negotiation. So I joined the team advising Palestinian leadership on peace negotiations with Israel. I believe then, as I do now, that there is no good future for anyone there, Israeli, Palestinian, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, without a good reality for everyone. Fundamental human rights matter, and we'll say more about that. I'm guessing as we go on. And I did that for 4 years, and I was on the negotiations, and that was a turbulent time. It's 2004 to 2008. But during that time, I got this idea for Telos when I met a man named Todd Deathridge, who I could tell you a little bit more about. But I did want to say one last thing in this very lengthy introduction, and that was just a little bit more about my grandmother, Fahima, Fahima Sahuri. Fahima was from Gaza, and Fahima grew up in Gaza City, and she went to the Orthodox Church there, which is the third oldest living church in the world, and which today is dying. Just after October 7th, Israel bombed the church. As I was actually speaking to journalists, because I knew all of these people, these Christians were seeking refuge in the church, their place of refuge. They want to stay there. This has been their home, and it's a tiny Christian community there. And they were already imperiled, in so many different ways. But, her church was bombed, and 11 members of her family, whom I did not know, were killed. And the remainder are still there today as we're recording this, and starving. And it's just a horrific reality. And you hear a lot and see the absolute devastation in Gaza before and after the horrific attacks of October 7th, but particularly after. And a story that's missed is the devastation on this last Christian community that has been calling out for decades, Keri, to other Christians to finally see them and pay attention. And yet Christians are cheerleading on what many people around the world are calling a genocide. And Keri, Christians are dying at a faster rate in Gaza than anywhere else. 3% of all Christians in Gaza have already been killed. 95% homeless. Like 3% killed in just a few months. That community was already small, but they were mighty. They're going extinct. And yes, Israeli bombs are part of the cause of this, occupation, what many call apartheid, intolerance, terrorism, fundamentalism, whether it's Islamic or Christian or Jewish, but yes, Christian as well, who've completely turned a blind eye and put this into this stupid story of black and white about evil Muslims and good Christians and all of this theology out there, completely ignoring the human beings, the people created equal in the image of God right in front of them. And it's just an absolute travesty in this moment. Absolute travesty.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And I'm grateful for your passionate introduction that also helps us to know why your heart is so invested in this and the realities of what's happening right in this moment as we're talking. And I'm just aware of how much you experience that in tremendous ways beyond what the rest of us experience at watching. I will never forget going on a trip with you. It must have been 10 years ago, and wrapping my head around the implications of the theology I had walking into that trip. And I think there are probably people listening right now who are even unaware of the ways that they have been formed to have a particular view. And I think this moment feels inciting and indicting and illuminating. I do think people are saying like, whoa, wait a minute, how is this the way? Even though they were taught there was a particular Christian view and a particular Christian way, and people are wrestling right now. And now perhaps in new ways, leaning in to listen and to say, wait, what's actually happening? How are we as Christians complicit in what's happening? What's the history and the backdrop to this moment? And my hope is that these conversations will help equip people to understand. One, I mean, the moment for me of standing on the rooftop of Aida refugee camp and seeing the bottle rockets that said "Made in the USA" and having this conversation of like, wait, I am an American standing here. I have contributed to this harm that's taken place here before I even stood here, and when I leave, I will not fail to be an American. So I will go back home and have some sense of agency or privilege to steward now on behalf of what's happening here. People listening to this right now don't have that opportunity to go and have that experience. But would you set for us some of the backdrop that led up to the moment on October 7th that might help people understand the political or historical backdrop that led up to that moment? Is that okay to ask?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's a lot in there. And so maybe we can like parse some of this out. And I heard you ask sort of, a question about Christians and the Christian backdrop. And we're
Yeah.
speaking to largely Christian audience. I need to, say I'm not a theologian. I also don't like to call myself a Christian typically. So like, I don't know how I would not see myself as sort of like an insider in this community. I did call myself a Palestinian Christian because that's the community that I come from and am associated with. My family's a part of. But I think there's a long history of like Christian engagement in the world since the birth of Jesus, literally. And some of that engagement is truly transformation. And I don't want to lose sight of that, like, because I'm going to point out a couple ways in which Christian theology has been bastardized, even weaponized,
Yeah.
to pursue aims that look nothing like the teachings of Jesus. But I also want to highlight in this moment, before we go a little further, the ways in which Christians and Christian theology have been truly transformative. They've pointed to a different economy, a kingdom economy that front and centers mutual flourishing, the value of all human life in God's eyes, whatever we consider God to be, right? And this idea that how can I deny my neighbor what I would want for myself? Or there is a possibility if we want true security. And by the way, this is actually rooted in international law. I happen to be a lawyer, as I may have mentioned, that when we think about actual security, our security is intertwined, and it's naive to think otherwise. It's naive to think that all of this money and energy spent on destroying and decimating entire peoples will lead to any real security. It will lead to more power and wealth for
Which is
some,
not
which is
security.
temporary. Yeah, but that is not safety.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's, and so I just want to say that because like there've been so many, if you look at so many of the social movements from, we've also traveled together in the US South, Keri, and you look at the transformational social movements here in America, like everybody forgets Martin Luther King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was really sort of bringing up a mirror to Christian America and saying, hey, this is what you say you believe. We're going to actually live it out.
And
This
disguised in some ways by revealing that gap, right? It's painful and uncomfortable to have to see the reality that you don't want to see. But he did that with an invitation.
He did that. And if you look at other leaders, like, in South Africa, so many of the anti-apartheid activists came from Christian backgrounds, anti-colonialist act, so many transformations throughout history, Wilberforce, like all of these people took a different expression of the gospel that was very centered primarily on the teachings of Jesus. And I want to front and center that because I think we're all in a moment of radical choice right now. The world is at a point of pivot. What's happening in the Middle East, this could not be bigger right now. All of our lives are forever changed by what happened, the atrocities on October 7th and the responses after October 7th. And there's a larger story here that we're going to dive into, but I want to say that we're at a moment of inflection for the world. And Christians have a particular role to play because some Christians and some Christian theology has been one of the authors of what we're seeing. But Christians also can be an author of the way out. And so why my mind went there is because like I think there's an interesting place to start. And that's with the way that Christians have been involved in the modern Middle East. We hear about Zionism. Zionism is Jewish nationalism. It's the idea that, hey, why should the Jewish people be denied what every other people has, which is the right of self-determination,
Mhm.
you know? And so Zionism is an answer to this problem of age-old anti-Semitism. And Zionism is an interesting concept. I think in many ways it's very problematic. We can get into that. But Zionism actually, among Jews, started first with Christians. And that's a story that's often not told. But the problem of Zionism or the question of Zionism rather, like I think there's an even more precedent question, and that's of anti-Semitism, the othering and the bigotry against Jewish people. And what many Christians may not know is that the origins of anti-Semitism lie in bastardized Christian theology, like replacement theology, for
Mm.
example,
Mhm.
which said, oh, you Jews killed Jesus chosen people and you're evil and we can do whatever we want to you. Martin Luther, Protestant Reformation, his 95 Theses, Martin Luther was a raging anti-Semite. And so you saw so much persecution against Jews simply for being Jewish throughout history
Mhm.
because of Christian theology. And Nazism used a lot of these bastardized ideas of Christian theology to rationalize and even sanctify
Mhm.
hatred and demonization of Jewish people. And so part of the story of the modern nation state of Israel, which is different from biblical Israel, comes back to this age-old problem of anti-Semitism, which is not exclusive to Christians. I'm not trying to like bash all Christians, but
Sure.
what I am trying to say is that what Christians need to do as we engage these issues is to atone for our responsibility here. And part of the responsibility that we have in the world is and unfortunately that other Christians, some Christians, maybe sometimes ourselves, have used these teachings in a way to advance our own interests and to demonize others. And consistently that's been for anti-Semitism. You know, Keri, one of the interesting things when you think about like Zionism and this idea of um, Jewish self-determination, but like in Christian Zionist circles, like theologically, of trying to get Jewish people back to Israel, is that a lot of this isn't actually love for Jewish people. It's also anti-Semitic. Part of this was, let's get rid of the Jews among us, or let's believe in this larger end times theology, this eschatology, end times eschatology about, oh, well, for Jesus to return, the Jewish people need to come back,
Right.
to Israel. And there are a lot of variations on Christian Zionism theologically. There's some people who reject the end times, but I think the central tenet for many Christians right now is that they believe that Israel and the Jewish people play a special role in God's larger plan for the world. And going back to Genesis, this idea of like, I'll bless those who bless you, God to Abraham, curse those who curse you. Prosperity gospel, people want to be blessed, people don't want to be cursed, they want to honor Israel. And some, I think some do have, I think it's a minority among Christian Zionists, but some do have that perspective, that longer perspective of wanting to atone for the system, for the history of Christian anti-Semitism. And a lot of this came to a head in the early 20th century, in Europe. So we can get more into that, but maybe we're going too far in the historical or theoretical weeds for you right now.
No, it's super helpful. And I think part of what happens in that sort of fundamentalist or conservative model of church is people are told what to believe and they're not always sure why. And I think this moment, as a moment of inflection, is forcing people to excavate a bit deeper on why they were handed these things or why they have, voted in certain ways, why they have supported the state of Israel in certain way. I think this is like that moment of inflection and reflection individually. So I think that's super helpful. We talked about Christian Zionism and sort of end times eschatology with the Bible scholar and dove into some of those streams of thinking. Do you have a particular direction you want to go in now, or do you want me to follow up with some?
No, I mean, like we could stay stuck in history or we can connect. Like, I want to know where you want to go. If you've had those conversations, awesome. People listen.
But your perspective is so good on that too, and such a healthy invitation to reckon with all of us as Christians, whether you still are steeped in a system of sort of a colonial version of Christ, which many people in the West have this sort of colonized Christianity, or whether you would say perhaps you have reformed some of those beliefs and have a more liberative view, all of us have a legacy in this moment. All of us will have impact in what our beliefs represent in this moment.
Well, yeah, no, and I wanted to say too, like, there's ways to sort of peel back a variety of those layers. So first is a responsibility that Christianity and particular Christian theologies have been used to sanctify evil consistently.
Yes.
Just as other theologies and perspectives of Jesus have been used to liberate, some have been used to denigrate and are used to denigrate. And in fact, Christian Zionist theology, the same theological roots have been used to sanctify everything from apartheid to slavery to colonialism to Jim Crow. Like before there were apartheid laws, there was an apartheid theology that was developed at Stellenbosch, seminary and preached in churches in Cape Town and beyond. So what I'm saying is that, as you peel back these layers, you see this, but there are all sorts of externalities. And I think the Palestinian is an externality because what often happens is there's just, there are a lot of reasons for why these particular views on Israel, which I would view as ultimately anti-Jewish as well, like not inconsistent with a human rights message or the equality and dignity of all human being, and sometimes making out Jewish people to be exceptional in this way, which is they're not multidimensional human beings like us. They're somehow like, it's called philo-Semitism. It's another form of anti-Semitism. But what I wanted to get at is sometimes like it blinds us to other people, and there's externalities here. And Palestinians just become a shadow. We have no agency. Nobody knows our stories. Nobody knows that we were connected and rooted in this land for thousands of years, that there's a diversity of Palestinian thought and experience. Instead, we are just presumptively anti-Semites. We are presumptively angry. We're presumptively rejectionist. When we talk about any of our experience, did you know, for example, the vast majority of Palestinians are refugees still? Zionism had many manifestations, but
Iterations. Yeah.
iterations, but it settled on this idea of building a Jewish state in Palestine when there were minority Jewish people there. This is the birthplace of Judaism, right? So there's this historic connection that no one could deny, and an unbroken chain of Jewish people living in Palestine for 3,500 years. But the Zionist vision that came from Western Europe at this time and was sanctioned by Britain and other colonial powers, like, had this idea for a Jewish majority state. And so what happens when the people who are living there are not Jewish? Like, well, what happened? 3/4 were kicked out or expelled from their homes and never allowed to return. And you'll hear all sorts of like fraught argumentation about this, like, oh my gosh, well, but Arab leaders just, they told them to leave so they could massacre Jews. Like, of one, that's historically disproven by Israeli scholars, in fact, right-wing scholars. For many years, that was not like actually what happened en masse. But two, there was this larger movement that sought to establish a majority Jewish state in a place where there were a minority, but growing minority of Jews, especially, leading up to and post-Holocaust in Europe. And so what happened is 3/4 of Palestinians, Muslims and Christians, were kicked out of their homes, never allowed to return. And simply saying that like my family was wrongfully kicked out of their homes. My family suffered massacres because thousands of Palestinian civilians were massacred. There was mass rape in what was called the Nakba, the catastrophe that began in 47, 48, which many Palestinians and many scholars actually see as continuing today, but just in fits and starts. And now we're at sort of like, a mass inflection point with Gaza again. But like this idea that, wait a second, like simply saying what happened to my family is wrong, that they didn't deserve to be kicked out from their homes or massacred. Like they deserve to stay in their homes, and there should be some redress for that. Like somehow that's deemed as deeply anti-Semitic. And this is the world that we've arrived in. And so I'm mentioning that because Palestinians become the externality of like this focus on one or the other. And what we've tried to focus on, and what I've tried to focus on, is this larger truth, this larger telos, shalom in Greek, or wholeness, or ultimate purpose, that goal that you're striving towards, which is the idea that we are all fundamentally created equal, and that matters. And the only way that we can really claim our full agency in this world is to maximize freedom for everyone. I cannot deny my neighbor what I would want. That's in Israel, Palestine, that's here in America, that's everywhere. And that can sound really loosey-goosey, but why is that important? I know a lot of your listeners were just triggered by that very mild telling of some Palestinian stories, because it's like, what about? No, this is not diminishing the experience of Jewish people or Israeli Jews. Instead, this is saying, look, what we need to focus all of our energies on is this larger vision, and anything that is dehumanizing, destabilizing, destroying our prospects to secure the fundamental rights for Palestinians or Israelis is an enemy of that our mutual flourishing. It creates a capacity for common cause rather than this polarized tribalization that will only lead us into endless conflict perpetually.
Yeah. And has over and over and over again. You talked about a few minutes ago, and you just talked about it now, the reality that securing peace and security, weaponization, war, acquiring weapons is not going to actually create safety. And that one group having safety or power or agency and another group not having that, that's not safe for any of us. That's not true agency, dignity, safety. Would you share a bit more about part of this is why you and Todd created this organization, right? Because you had a different vision for safety and flourishing and dignity. Would you give us a little bit of the story of that, how you got engaged? You were engaged as a lawyer in this work, but now you're engaged in a different way.
Yeah, sure. I want to tell two stories, if I might. I want to tell the story of like meeting Todd and starting Telos. And then I also want to tell a little bit story, go back a little bit further to Gaza,
Yes.
because I was one of the, in 2005, Israel removed all of its settlements, Jewish-only towns, the Gaza Strip, and all of its military bases in something called the disengagement.
Yeah.
And so I worked on this, and everything that you saw today was predicted. I just want you to know that, like, there was no intelligence failure. That there wasn't an intelligence failure in knowing that Hamas was going to attack at this scale and when and whatnot, but there was no intelligence failure. Everyone who's worked on these issues knew this was coming for years, knew this was inevitable, and knew exactly how to stop it. And so, like, if you hear anybody talking about like inevitability and we have no choice, sorry, that is absolute bullshit, and I've got the receipt. So I want to come back to that story.
I'm so glad. Yes. Yep.
But you asked this question about sort of like mutual flourishing in a different version. I first met this man named Todd Deathridge in Jerusalem in 2004. I was new, young lawyer on the job advising Palestinian leadership. He was at the State Department. And he comes from a totally different background. Todd's, Republican, pretty liberal Democrat, if you haven't figured that out already. He's from Arkansas, evangelical Christian. I'm a progressive, half Palestinian, half Danish, like totally different people, right? Had I met Todd here, honestly, I would have put him in a cage, like, because Todd literally stood for almost, or rather stood against almost everything that I stood for. Like, he's the person you don't talk to. But I met him on the ground in Jerusalem. It was my job to take him around and brief him on the realities on the ground as he was writing this report for the State Department. And I wanted to see what I saw. I believed then, as I still believe today, that like every Palestinian and no Palestinian or Israeli would ever know the security, justice, dignity, freedom they all deserved until America changed its policy. That sounds like a big conclusion for a lot who are just listening in, but I'm just saying, just bear with me, believe me for a second, that Americans needed to know then and now totally different stories of the reality on the ground. And when I took Todd around, he still cared for Israel, loved Israel in a way that, I won't, given my experience, right? But he saw a different story, and seeing those realities of Palestinians, seeing their stories, he started to say, oh my God, wait a second. This is not sustainable. This is not good for anyone ultimately, particularly for Palestinians living under that reality then, and and for Israelis in the long term. And Todd called that day life changing. Um, Fast forward, 4 years, I'd spent those years on the negotiating team. I'd witnessed hundreds of people, thousands of leaders transform, and I was done, like on the ground there and wrestling with all sorts of questions I still haven't answered about, like, what's the ethical way to sort of live out my values? Am I doing that? Am I, all these things in this crazy, crazy world and crazy life. But I had an idea, and I thought, like, what if you could enable thousands of Americans, Republican, Democrat, believer, non-believer, but especially Christians, to have similar experiences to Todd and to see the realities on the ground for Israelis and Palestinians. Like, could we then take these people and weave them into this missing movement for peace? In this country, you're like, so I think this is particularly fraught now. It's like either you're pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. Like, you've got to, like, take this side, and the other side is spawn of Satan, like absolute evil, like all terrorists who want to destroy the world, or Nazis, or whatever. Like, this is just this choice. And I keep coming back to those fundamental truths that I know in these moments and others, that, like, wait a second, like, human rights actually is human security. And so and that may sound wishy-washy. Again, I've got the receipts for that, but just to complete the story of Telos, like, it was a really transformational moment for me, because I had this idea and, thought, if, like, you could get people on these trips, give them these transformations, and then actually build movement. And so I went and met with Todd in a Starbucks near the State Department. I sat down and I told him the story. I was, like, super exuberant about it. And then he shocked me, like, totally. He's like, huh, interesting. I had a similar idea. People first need to see what I saw. That's key. Let me build this with you. And that was a transformational moment in my life, because here's this, like, senior State Department official, got 4 kids in school. This is 2008, just before Lehman Brothers fails. He could go out, get any plum lobbying job after that, make a lot of money. And, this crazy conservative Christian decided to risk literally everything. And we decided to found Telos the week after Lehman Brothers failed. No money, no economy, because he believed this was the right thing. He said, look, it's my people, my community that needs to know a different story, and there needs to be a different way. That's, like, called real sort of, like, balls, like, right there. Like, that's actually embodying their values, taking real risks to say,
putting your money where your mouth is.
It is. And so we did, and we founded Telos. And 15 years later, it's been a journey, but we're going strong, and we've taken a couple thousand leaders out, and people's views are changing around the world, but particularly here in America, because of the visions that our alumni, like you and so many others, have been casting in their families, and then publicly writing books, best-selling books, novels, thousands of sermons, movies. Just getting the message out there that this is a false choice to call yourself pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian. What we need are fundamental human rights for everyone. And that's not kumbaya, because the reality that we were trying to engage then and the reality that we're seeing now, which is so horrific, was unsustainable from a moral perspective and a security perspective. You can't have one group of people indefinitely rule over another. Nothing good will come of that. Hamas was founded in 1987. This is 40 years after the Palestinian refugee flow began. Like, these injustices beget other injustices. There is absolutely no reason why Israelis and Palestinians cannot live together. You may not see that today. Let me tell you, somebody who's lived on the ground and who works with the most remarkable change agents on the face of the planet. We wanted at Telos, and I wanted personally, I didn't want you to convert you to my perspective on the world as Greg, this crazy liberal Palestinian, Danish, whatever, right? Like, I don't need you to become me.
Mhm.
But I wanted you to know that we can become we, and we is a recognition that our dignity is intertwined and it can be embodied. And there's so many people out there doing the hard work, building new forms of community and building new resilience, even when they've lost their children. I was just with Robbie Damlin last night. She's a great Israeli friend, literal, family to me. Her son David was killed by an Israeli sniper, and she, this was 20 years ago, and she's gone on this transformational journey, but taking others with her, joining hundreds of other Israeli and Palestinian families to say, not one more drop of blood in my name. And coming here, I was with her at a synagogue in New York last night, speaking with a Palestinian partner, Muhammad, whose brother, when he was 14, his 16-year-old brother was shot in the neck and killed right in front of him and bled out to die under an Israeli tank, just as they were playing soccer in Jenin. And they've both joined to say there's another way to do this. And Robbie, since October 7th, she's 80 years old now. She has been nonstop, 24 hours a day, taking shit from her own community, from some members of her own community, but out there reminding us that this is how we got here.
Yeah.
Like what you're saying in Gaza, this is how we got to this mess. This is not how we get out. And so, Telos has been on this incredible journey. We've evolved into other issue areas, but our purpose has been to be radically honest. You're going to know what I think if you engage me,
Yeah.
but to also be radically open to give other people to go on their journey. Because one of the things I know to be true is that my story is not the only story, that I don't own all the truth, that all of us have a piece of the divine, whatever that is. It's not just one of us trying to lord over and invite you to my home and let me tell you how things are. That real peace, real security, real resilience doesn't mean we don't have conflict, but it means that conflict drives us to better versions of ourselves instead of using conflict to destroy and erase the other.
Yeah.
I got a little off, but that's what, one way of telling the Telos story that I've never told about it before, but I'm just,
The radical honesty, the radical openness, the imagination expanding, I mean, heart shattering perspective to say there are multiple narratives playing out here, and you have an incomplete story if you've not entered into the stories of everyone impacted right now.
And there's objective truth,
Mhm.
there's those two things. One of the things we developed at Telos are these principles and practices of peacemaking. I would really love if your folks would like to engage them. There's 6 principles, 6 practices, and the principles are sort of the foundation of what it looks like for there to be true peace in the world. They include things like growth, the idea that change is always possible because we're constantly changing. If you don't believe that, what are you doing here? That's the fundamental constant in life.
Mhm.
It's not, this is all evolving every minute, whether we like it or not, and we're all part of the changing, right? Mitri Raheb, whom we met, the pastor in Bethlehem, often says, hope is what you do. Hope is it's not an adjective. It's a verb. So growth is significant. Equity is a second principle. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all 12, but I wanted to get to one of the practices. But equity is a really charged word politically in our culture right now. And I get it, but there's a different way to think about equity, and you'll see why this is important. We often conflate equity and equality,
Mhm.
but equity is really the foundation. It's the bedrock of peacemaking, because equality asks who's at the table.
Mhm.
Equity instead asks, whose table is it? If we're doing real peacemaking, this is our shared reality. We are co-owners. When you think of equity, think about ownership. It's not me telling you what to do and how to behave in my home. It's us making sure that we're building a home together. And if you don't have equity, you have imbalance, this inequity, which leads to conflict. Another thing I just wanted to highlight was one of the practices. It's a second practice. It's called hold competing perspectives in tension. And this is one step, an early step, not the final step for peacemaking, but this is one that I think is so helpful for people because it gets to what you said, that there's multiple realities, that and narratives that we must engage. And there's a funny way to describe this. It's Keri, do you remember the white and gold dress,
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
was it blue and
Was it blue? Yeah. Was it teal? Or
black?
was it, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right, remember, and everybody, we all seen that internet meme, but guess what? Everybody was telling the truth because you either saw it as you're looking at the same thing and you're seeing something differently. And Niels Bohr, who was a pioneer of quantum physics, the subatomic field of physics, famously said, the opposite of a fact is falsehood, but the opposite of one profound truth may very well be another profound truth. And we tend to forget that, because when we're engaging people, when we're reading, when we're listening, when you're listening to me, we often have this tendency, when I listen to you, to think about, wait, how does this relate to what I know to be true? We tend to diminish the other instead of allowing for this radical openness to say, okay, there is an objective reality that we're all part of, but I may not be privy to all of it. And here, my friend here may also be an expert of their own experience and their own reality. And if we're really trying to create a place in which we can all flourish, we have to at least allow ourselves a space and create a space in which we can engage each other on each other's terms. How we do that, that's complicated, but I wanted to put that out there because I think it is holding another perspective in tension, that multiple things are true at the same time, and there is an objective reality. In Israel-Palestine, that objective reality comes back to multiple truths being the Jewish people are perhaps the most persecuted people in history, and had a recent genocide. And there are actors in Palestinian society who are clearly anti-Semitic and have engaged in terrorism. And there are Palestinians who, every Palestinian has been living wherever they are in the world, a horrific reality. And that's true. And they've suffered unjustifiable losses. And October 7th is a horrific, unjustifiable attack. I mean, I want to pause there for a second because, I think many Palestinians feel so frustrated with the fact that to narrate our own stories, we have to go through 20 minutes of like condemning Hamas and saying, oh, I'm a good Palestinian, which is fitting into this anti-Palestinian story about you're all a bunch of terrorists and you're all a bunch of anti-Semites. And well, if you just learn to love Israel, then everything would end. And oh, you're one of the good ones, so we'll listen to you. Oh, too bad there aren't more of you, Greg, right? So like, it's this really horrible experience and frustration for Palestinians that like, wait a second, like we're not allowed to tell you what happened to us, and without it being called whataboutism or anti-Semitism or even genocidal by some segments of our society. But what I wanted to share about that is that one, like my perspective as a Palestinian views certain things as a human first before being Palestinian, Danish, American, all these different things. There are certain things which are unjustifiable. There's never a defense, like rape, mass rape. You can never do that and say, well, oh, this was serving this military objective. Like, no, that is absolutely indefensible. What happened on October 7th, nothing that happened to Palestinians, in my view, for decades justifies, right? But also, we need to know what happened to Palestinians every single day for decades before October 7th. You may not want to hear this, and you may not know, and you may say, no, that's not true, Greg. It is true. Suffered unjustifiable horrors every single day for decades, which people won't even acknowledge or ignore. I'm just even thinking, one of my cousins whom you met, Keri, and I'm not going to say her name, but her house just 10 days ago in Beit Sahur. This is in Bethlehem. This is just between
Not in
Bethlehem and
Gaza,
Jerusalem.
right? This is not in Gaza. This is outside of
No,
what's happening in Gaza.
Gaza is like on the Mediterranean Sea. This is by Jerusalem. Like this is outside of anything that's happening. Israeli soldiers came into my cousin's home, as they've done before, ransacked the whole place, destroyed her furniture, stole the money, beat up her 11-year-old grandson, and then knocked the cross off the wall, broke the cross, and said, basically, get the fuck out of here. What are Christians doing here? This is no place for Christians. In the birthplace of Christ. Do you understand? That's a daily occurrence. The reality that Palestinians have lived under, whether in Gaza or the West Bank, is one of absolute subjugation. There are different standards. Some have it easier than others. Like Gaza has been really, really tough these past 17 years, and we haven't really talked about Gaza that much. But like where my family lives, they don't have running water except a few hours a day. They put it up into tanks. I can tell you when I was on the negotiating team, sometimes we would run out of water in my Uncle Hanna's house, 80-year-old uncle. because the Israelis who control the water faucet, same water infrastructure for everyone. You got the settlements right there, right across from my cousin Khalil's home. There's Har Homa, like a neighborhood of Jerusalem, technically an Israeli settlement built partly on land that we have title to going back generations after generations. They have manicured lawns and swimming pools. You're just, a few hundred meters apart. Like you get running water, a few times, a few hours every few days, and then you put it into these tanks so it feels like you have running water. But guess what? Sometimes during the summer, it doesn't come and it runs out. And so I there's so many times, like, because my family's not allowed to leave these areas. It's like, these are like these little ghettos with, this occasionally you'll get these permits, but they're not allowed to use the airport like that I'm allowed to use because I'm an American citizen and I have this unique status and whatnot. And like, I would even take a shower to get on a 12-hour flight by buying bottled water, putting it in a pail and taking a measuring cup. These kinds of indignities that I just described are nothing compared to, 112 days in Gaza of horrors that most human beings have never endured throughout human history, right? No comparison. But what I'm telling you is this, that Palestinians have not known a second or an ounce of freedom for decades, And it does not justify, nothing could justify what happened on October 7th. But what happened on October 7th, all of these things that you're seeing, guess what? We knew we were headed to a bad place. You cannot continue to control and rule over a people and expect anything good to come of that. We all want our freedom and we all deserve it. Fundamental human rights is the bedrock of true safety and security for everyone.
Yes. Yes. Undeniable. There's no other way around it. That's the telos that you're working towards. You had two stories, one about the foundation and formation of telos and one about Gaza and disengagement there. If you remember what it is, it would be great to talk about Gaza particularly, and then maybe to explore anything that listeners could actually do to engage in this moment as these atrocities continue to unfold.
Great. Let's wrap up there. And I want to highlight there's a lot you can do. Like, this is not happening out there. This is happening inside of us, in our families, our communities, our churches, our government. And this could not be more significant. Our lives are forever changed. We are all at the beginning, not just Israelis and Palestinians, but all of us, and we're all implicated. So I want you to listen. I want to tell a little bit of a story about Gaza. It may be a little bit technical, but I want you to understand. Again, this was all predicted. So I worked on the negotiating team, advising Palestinian leadership 2004 to 2008. There was a former Israeli prime minister named Ariel Sharon. He, like Netanyahu, the current Israeli prime minister, was known as a hawk, right wing, all about war. At this time, it was at the end of the Second Intifada, or Palestinian uprising. There had been a number of Palestinian suicide bombings. So Palestinians had gone and blown themselves up on buses, cafes, killed horrifically a number of Israeli civilians and soldiers. And so at this time, Ariel Sharon said there's no Palestinian partner for peace. But what we're going to do, and this was a shock to everybody, including Israelis, is we're going to make a huge gesture to peace, to see if there's a peace partner out there. And what we're going to do is, you say the problem is not with Palestinians hating Jews, but with Israeli settlements. And so we're going to remove some settlements, something we've never done before from Palestinian territory. And we're going to do that from the Gaza Strip. Israelis were incredulous. They're like, what? Well, not, it divided Israeli society. Some Israelis were like, okay, well, not sure. Sharon's like, but maybe this will be a gesture towards peace. Maybe Palestinians will finally come and negotiate peace with us. And Palestinians were, but some were like, no, don't do it. Don't do that without, don't give up anything without anything in return, right? And so there was this division in Israeli society. Palestinians were incredulous too. Many Palestinians were like, Ariel Sharon, never. This is another sort of thing. He's speaking out of his, two sides of his mouth, whatnot, trying to appease the international community. who are frustrated that there are no negotiations at the time. And some other Palestinians, like me, were a little bit more cynical. Why? First, we knew the realities on the ground in the Gaza Strip. And second, we read the actual plan itself. So the realities on the ground. In 2004, there were 1.3 million Palestinians in Gaza. Today, 2.2 million. Out of those 1.3 million, 80% refugees, mainly from villages and towns in Israel built around where the massacres took place on October 7th. Again, does not justify, doesn't even explain, but I want you to understand that. Gaza, 8,000 settlers, 1.3 million Palestinians. 8,000 settlers controlled 20% of the land, used 700% more water per person than that allotted local Palestinians in one of the most densely populated areas on the planet, the majority children, the majority refugees. So these settlements were a huge burden, militarily, having to protect them, economically, diplomatically, defending. How do you control all of these people without, and deprive these Gazans of their freedom? Like for what? For 8,000 settlers living in these luxury seaside, agricultural communities with farms and these spacious villas and whatnot. So this was a real burden for Israel. But meanwhile, the West Bank, which is like on the other side, it's by the Jordan River, Gaza Strip by the Mediterranean Sea in Egypt. What do you have in the West Bank? You have East Jerusalem. You have water resources. You have all of these things that Israel wanted. And if you read the disengagement plan itself, what did it say? It said it was not just going to remove these settlers from the Gaza Strip and 4 tiny settlements in the northern West Bank, but it was going to strengthen Israeli control in and around Jerusalem, expand the so-called security barrier wall in Jerusalem. And in the same year that Israel was moving 8,000 settlers out of Gaza, it approved plans for 30,000 more in the West Bank. It was basically a shell game. And what was Sharon and what was his chief advisor, Dov Weissglass, saying about this at the time? He was saying, hey, the purpose of disengagement to Israelis, right, not to the international community, is to pour formaldehyde on the peace process, to prevent any possibility of a two-state solution. Why? You divide Palestinians, then there's no one ever to negotiate with, because who can speak for Palestinians in West Bank?
Represent them. Yeah.
Who can represent them? Divide and conquer. And so, and I'll get back to that in 1 second. But this is stuff I want all of you to Google. If you're like, no, Chris, because this is public record. Yeah. This is all public record. And so at the time, it's strategy. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It's a game. It's how do you get what you want? And so we were in a real tough position. We're seeing these public statements, the international community being like the United States, EU, Russia, UK, United Nations, all saying, well, Israel's like Ariel Sharon is making a move for peace. Let's figure out a way to leverage this into something. Okay. And so like, we've got to make the most of disengagement. So we went into this process for like negotiating the technical aspects of negotiations. What would Gaza look like the day after disengagement? You've heard that day after language a lot before, right? And so everyone came out, from President Bush at the time, Condoleezza Rice, who personally negotiated over 8 months, along with James Wolfenson, the former head of the World Bank, all of these agreements on how goods and people would get in and out of the Gaza Strip. Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, Prime Minister Tony Blair. I can go down this whole list. Israeli Shin Bet even said the same thing. What did they all say? They said Gaza would become a humanitarian and political disaster by the year 2020 unless Gaza and its people had access to the outside world. We negotiated all these protocols, free movement of goods and services. A 4-star US general, General Keith Dayton, came out on the ground for 2 years to make sure goods and services could get in, goods and people freely, so Gaza could have some independence and not just be dependent upon sacks of flour from the international community, all with the presumption that if Gazans couldn't take care of themselves, have their own economy, not just be an aid economy, like just getting that Hamas and Islamic Jihad would get stronger. You'd have political extremism and you'd have humanitarian crisis. What did we see? We saw a couple things. One, we saw Israel never implemented these agreements. There's a lot of like storytelling around that, but that's the core thing. Israel never implemented those agreements. And we saw stated Israeli policy going back to 2007 that it was in Israel's right-wing interest to make Hamas stronger. Why? Have Gaza, this unrulable territory that can't take care of itself.
Mhm.
How would you ever let Palestinians have freedom? See, look, Hamas, these evil, we just have to keep having these skirmishes with them over and over. And then meanwhile, you continue to settle and grow the West Bank. And that's exactly what happened. Netanyahu then and now described Hamas rule until October 6th as a strategic asset. When Hamas was founded in 1987-88, Google this, as a counter to Palestinian Fatah, just after the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist. They funded Hamas from the very beginning. As a spoiler, they said Hamas was a strategic asset. They helped enable Hamas. You hear all about the tunnels. Some of those tunnels, former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, again, Google this, with Christian Amanpour, recently admitted that they built the tunnels under Al-Shifa Hospital. Hamas built many of these tunnels, but Israel didn't want to close them down, because if Israel had closed them down, then they would have to take more responsibility over Gaza, because after Israel pulled out, it didn't leave Gaza alone. It turned Gaza into a large, what a former senior UN official described as, a large open air prison that Israel simply threw away the key. So Gaza was set up to fail, and it's particularly tragic. I forgot to mention just one little point that I love to highlight. Gaza is one of the oldest and continuously inhabited places on Earth. One of two libraries in antiquity, Alexandria, and then in Gaza, was in Gaza City. These people know how to do it. And when we talked about the refugee problem, like, Gazans are so beautiful. They're such wonderful, amazing people. But imagine in your community, if your community tripled, its population tripled overnight in 3 months, with wounded, sick, traumatized refugees who never left. That's what happened to the Gaza Strip in 1948. This ancient cosmopolitan place had this massive wound, and all these people locked into virtual cages, never allowed to leave. After disengagement, which I worked on, that was 2005, 2007, this extreme closure instituted multiple wars, 5 wars against Gaza. Every good drop of water person in and out of Gaza ultimately controlled by Israel, even with the Egyptian border. So what do you expect to happen? This isn't to say that Israel doesn't have a right to self-defense or security. Of course they do. It isn't to say that Palestinians don't have a right to self-defense, security, and resistance. Of course they do. What it is to say is that there are limits to those. You can never target civilians. What it is to say is creating a system, not in which some people never have their rights for generations. You only will have rotten fruit, because that is a rotten system. And that's what we're seeing today. Does not justify Hamas, but what it says is that, you see what's happening today, mission impossible to destroy Hamas. That's not what's happening. International court, US federal judge says plausible genocide happening, as almost 80% of buildings are destroyed in Gaza. All these facts you can see. It is to say that, maybe you can get Hamas's leadership, but the ideology there is growing. And the scary part there is, just as disengagement was about Jerusalem, so was today. Back when, in disengagement, we had, a lot of these right-wing, these are not representative of Israeli views or Jewish views, but there are right-wing extremist elements in Israel, as I think many of you are more aware. And these people were fringe. Some of them have long wanted to blow up Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the holiest sites in Jerusalem, that gold dome and then the gray dome against it, next to it. They want to blow it up so that they can rebuild a third Jewish temple there. Seriously, some of these guys are in power now. They're in Netanyahu's cabinet. What do you think happens? They're talking about completing the transfer. Already, millions of people displaced in Gaza, but not just of Palestinians there, but in my cousin's homes in the West Bank. in Jerusalem of Palestinians. And what do you think is going to happen? That's massive war. I was just at the State Department yesterday, and like they don't get it. They don't understand. They're thinking Hezbollah, Houthi. They're thinking Russia, China. Like Russia and China are salivating after Biden stepped in this trap left by Netanyahu, and who stepped into trap left by Hamas. Hamas knew exactly what was going to happen. The response, they wanted it. They made a strategic determination. Only way to change things up, it was to blow things up. It's horrible. But now Netanyahu knows that he's out of office if there's a real ceasefire, and the only thing is to blow things up. And these foreign powers, which want to restrict American power, are just doing that. And meanwhile, Biden is like operating from this like 20-year-old security paradigm, doesn't understand how the world works today. And he believes Hamas as he should, but he doesn't believe Netanyahu yelling right at him and all the
Right.
folks in his government. I know you want me to stop, so I'll stop because
I know.
Oh, well, what I wanted to just conclude is like, what can people do? But I'm trying to highlight why they should do something.
Yes,
This is
yes,
a
yes.
pivotal moment in world history.
Yeah.
You are positioned as an American or as a Westerner, and also as a Christian. If you are an American Christian, your voice is the most powerful of anyone on the face of the planet right now who's not in an actual position of power. Why? Biden and Democrats know they're losing this election. They're trying to get the persuadables. They've written off the progressives. They're looking at Christians. They early on said, oh, Christians are the ones who like tend to be evangelical, non-denominational. They love Israel. They don't get that you can love Israelis and Palestinians both at the same time, and you can be horrified that our government is letting this maniacal, crazy Israeli prime minister be the leader of the free world when they all saw him as the enemy of Israeli democracy on October 6th, which he still is today, and actually carrying out what many people, including genocide experts, are calling a genocide in Gaza today. We have voice and power like we've never had right now. What you can do, please sign up, follow us on social media, tell us, build the movement with Keri. The thing is not to just destroy like I began by highlighting the fact that just as Christianity and Jesus has been weaponized, so too has he liberated, and Christianity has been used as a force for good. Keri's movement right now is one of those movements within Christianity saying, hey, wait a second, we're not going to let you steal this. We're not going to let you use this and co-opt this for some false earthly power. No, we have a responsibility, and we know that there's a deeper truth here. Join these movements. But also, you need to know, speak up. Speak up when your body shakes. Speak up when you don't have the right words. Speak up when you get yelled at. Speak up to your family members. Speak up to your friends. Show up. People don't have a choice right now. I want to give you grace to take some grace for yourself. Like you're going to get tired. This is traumatic. I want you to give grace for your friends, your Jewish friends, your Palestinian friends, your Arab friends. All of us are deeply traumatized right now. So you have to understand that when you're engaging somebody who's traumatized, you have to be there and show up and be present with them. It's not about rationalizing them or convincing them, but showing up and being present with them doesn't mean sitting in a corner and being silent. You need to call your representatives, pastors, your pastors. How is it in the world that pastors are like, how do they think they can ever talk about peacemaking if they're just shutting up right now? They have lost any ability to say anything. Get them to read Munther Ishaq's Christmas sermon, my friend from Bethlehem. If he won't say anything, read it out loud. Platform that voice in your church every Sunday. If they won't say it, stand up and read it. Follow the lead of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and so many other great modern day prophets as well. They were just like you, just like me, flawed human beings trying to do the best with what they have. But what I'm trying to tell you is you have something. You have a voice, you have a body, you have comfort. Take care of yourself, relax, tend to your heart, tend to those you love, but don't be silent and don't just throw your hands up in the air, because remember that first rule of peacemaking, growth. The world is constantly changing. Keri, I'm going to take a sip of water, but I want to end with my favorite poem. And I know you may like cut all of this out, but what's that?
Not a chance.
Okay, no. And I I keep coming back to this incredible poem I heard first from one of the world's great peacemakers. Another action item, read all of John Paul Lederach's work, great Mennonite peacemaker. Start a book club around John Paul Lederach. But he introduced me to this poem and so many things which have changed my life. And this poem is from Hafez, the 14th century Muslim poet. The fool builds cages for everyone he knows, while the sage, who has to duck her head when the moon hangs low, keeps dropping keys all night long for all the beautiful, rowdy prisoners. I want you to remember that story is both cage and key. Mm-hmm. Story can destroy us. Story can build actual cages. Gaza Strip is an actual cage. That happens when we tell these stories about who these other people are, how evil they are, and how good we are, right? I want you to start dropping keys everywhere you go to another reality, but do it in a way that risks yourself, because these cages in our hearts and our minds, these cages are things that we reproduce with steel. You know, there's a lie out there in the world. It's that the way the world is the way the world will always be. And that's why I keep coming back to growth, right? The world is constantly changing. We know that is false because there's only one constant in the world, and that is change. We're all part of the change, for better or for worse, whether we like it or not. So it's not a question of whether or not one person can change the world, whether or not you have influence, because you do. That's what it means to be alive. The question is how. And in this moment, when everything is coming to head, these tragic stories of the millennial-long oppression of the Jewish people, the reality that anti-Semitism is at fever-pitched levels. Now that more people are paying attention, they're doing it without any nuance whatsoever and not understanding that anti-Semitism is a key reason why we're here in the first place. And we have to combat it. So too is anti-Palestinianism, the idea that our peoplehood doesn't matter, that you can just hate us and dismiss us as anti-Semites and anti-whatever and rejectionists. In this moment, you need to start listening, showing up, and speaking up. Every single lever you have. We won't know how it's going to have impact, but we know what the impact will be if you're silent. And so that speech can look like a variety of different things. It can be a hug to a dear friend who doesn't understand that you're there with them, but it has to include something political too. And that on this issue, because you're an American, you're Christian, you have more agency than any other people has ever had, ever, in this moment to change things. Speak up. Let your politicians know, no, they cannot get away with this. They cannot count on your vote in this particular way. It may feel futile, but show up and stand up. And when you get tired, look at all of those incredible people on the ground. Robbie Damlin, who I just mentioned, the Israeli mom who lost her son and since October 7th has lost her voice every single day saying, guys, this is how we got here, not how we get out. You've got to center human rights. You've got to stop this violence now, and we've got to create rights and opportunity for everyone. Use her story, use the other stories, use my story, whomever it is, but go out there. This is your time. This is our chance. If you question what you were doing in any of these things that we read about and watched movies about, it's what you're doing right now. And sadly, this is just the beginning, so we need your voice now more than ever. It will make a difference. I promise.
Every one of us has a part to play, and there's implications for what we're doing. We get to shape what that's going to be right now, but we are in this. There are consequences to how we show up or how we fail to show up in this moment. Greg, thank you for the wisdom and expertise that you brought, the perspective, and also your own personal pain and experience, the way all of that shaped this conversation. You're dropping keys for all of us, for a more free selves, for a more free world, to advocate for those who are being impacted, Israelis and Palestinians alike right now. Thank you. Thanks for engaging us. We can get information on Telos social media or website for if someone wants to call their senator and it's like, I don't know how to do this. I've never done any political advocacy. All the tools and resources are there. There's book lists if people need to dive into further learning, there's conversations. You all have a podcast, the peacemaking and principles and practices. All of this stuff is at our fingertips right now. Is that right?
Yeah, and we have courses like on Israel Palestine. Scripts, if you want to call your member, you just press a button. It takes 30 minutes and you can read a script if you don't know what to say, like all of that stuff. This could not be easier.
Thank you.
But it could not be more important. Thank you, Keri.
He'll just come in and be quiet. Not in here. He'll just come in the house and be quiet. No, I don't think we've had any conversations on here. Lots of conversations elsewhere. Mhm. Hey, Mike, thank you so much for having me. And I'm just thrilled that you're leaning into this conversation and that we get to talk about it here together. Thanks for having me. Yes, I didn't realize I had been engaged with them longer than you, but my journey, okay. I got invited on a trip, I don't know, 13 years ago, and I was actually 12 years ago, I was pregnant with my son, and I couldn't go. And I was really interested in why we were going, why we were taking leaders on this trip at the church that I worked at. So I started doing a little kind of pre-reading and pre-work, and then went on a trip, like an immersive experience in the Holy Land with a group of leaders. And it was more than I ever imagined, like that particular experience. It was really eye-opening in ways I had no idea what I was stepping into. It was really confronting in ways that as I went on this experience, we spent time with people on all sides of the conflict, if you will, which is more than just two sides. And I felt like it was revealing to me of the implications of my theology here over there. Like I couldn't unsee after this experience how tethered we were to the actual realities of the conflict that were playing out and the consequences and implications of those. And so in a lot of ways, it was like almost like a conversion experience. I came back and it had opened up a lot of things for me where I really had to wrestle with the implications of my theology, life and death implications. And so in some ways, it catalyzed a whole journey for me, both forming me in the capacity to have complexity and hold a dual narrative or multiple narrative, and really revealing and challenging me on the implications of my theology and what I believe and what I contribute to and the consequences of things I contribute to. So it was a really eye-opening, unearthing experience for me in a lot of ways. And then I engaged with them organizationally since then in several ways. I served on the board for a while. I took several delegations of leaders there, and then also helped explore like trips in other continents, post-apartheid reconciliation work in South Africa, leader training trips for the on-the-ground trips and the experience in Israel, Palestine, that type of stuff. So I've just gotten to volunteer with them for the last 12 years or so since that first engagement. Mhm. 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 Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Well, I mean, I'll just be really honest. At first, I had to wrestle through my own like anger and grief and frustration about what we were watching play out. And then I think I, in some ways, was relieved at the disillusionment that people started to name. Like, I really, for the last 10 years, as this has been part of my own journey of formation and reckoning and it was a big part of my sort of deconstruction and reconstruction of my own faith paradigm and my own understanding of the gospel and of theology. I took, coaching from Greg and Todd, the co-founders of this organization, and I just in opportunities began to tell stories or make references or, when I was teaching at churches, sometimes my experiences in the Holy Land would come up because it was so formational for me. And I actually started hearing from Christians all over at churches I had worked at or served at or taught at, some even friends that won't identify as Christian anymore, but they were saying, I have so many questions. It feels so complex. I don't understand what's happening. I don't understand our unfettered allegiance and alignment with Israel. I don't even know where I can ask the questions. And many of them said it feels so uncomfortable or so awkward, like I'm going to get it wrong even in the questions. So how can I learn? Like what resources can you point me to? So Telos, of course, is a resource that I point people to, but there's more than is just their work because there's historical implications, there's political implications, there's theological implications. The thing I wrestled with most is how integrated the church, the witness of the church in the West is with what's playing out in Israel Palestine, what has been for decades, and what in this moment is playing out. And so that was my own sort of complicity that I was wrestling with. It's why I had talked about it over the years. So I felt like, okay, I can't take all these people that I love so dearly to the land to understand. We don't have the luxury of that experience. How can I expose them to at least some pieces of the complexity and ways that they may not otherwise be exposed to in the news or on social media? And is there a way that we could create some space that we can learn and dive into these topics more so than just the political rhetoric that's playing out? I think many people, even my neighbors, when we talk about this that aren't Christians, feel really implicated in what's happening. And that's a reality. We are participating. And those of us that call ourselves followers of Jesus, I think, have a real invitation in this moment to discern how are we to steward our influence on behalf of the marginalized. And what Telos taught me is that there's no solution that's a solution for one party and not a solution for both parties. And so I find that sort of work is the most challenging for many of us. We love the binary, black and white, cut and dry. Nothing about this is that way. But that's, if I have to be certain about one thing, it's that if there's not dignity and agency and safety for both people groups being impacted right now, that's not offered to either of them. I'll pause there, but those were the conversations. And that's why I started this like meager thing of a podcast where we're just having some of these conversations publicly for people who want to dive in more. Yeah. It's called A Third Way, and we've talked about topics for the last several years that I was wrestling with other, mostly church leaders were facing. It was kind of the Nicodemus in the night behind closed doors conversations. And so I hadn't done it in a while, but when this moment presented itself, I had to find a way to put these conversations in the world. So it's sort of a new season called Mutuality in the Middle East, A Third Way, Mutuality in the Middle East. Mhm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Uh, the first reason that I wanted to engage in these conversations is because this is the moment that we have to. They're because of the lives being lost, because of the devastation that I perceive now for generations, we will feel the reverberations of this moment. And secondarily, I can't unsee how much what's happening there, and this ongoing retributive conflict is such a reflection to our own souls and systems and structures. Uh, the Israeli people have experienced atrocities unimaginable. Like, it is not that distant memory to talk about the Holocaust. And so this deep-seated need to protect and defend at all costs can make sense when you talk about that sort of devastation and harm. It's an atrocity beyond my imagination. And I've been to the Holocaust Museum, in the Middle East. It is more than we can fathom. And so it's understandable now, this need and desire to defect or to protect and defend and to advocate for safety. And I guess I know a little bit too much about some of the political implications, how none of this was a surprise. What happened on October 7th, ways that the state of Israel has funded Hamas in order to keep separate political parties amongst the Palestinian people. I mean, there's so much sort of baked into this moment, but to recognize there's not a solution that's good for Israeli people that is harmful to the Palestinian people, and vice versa. Our imagination is way too small if retribution is that. So while I can understand what has happened to get to this moment, to defend and protect and pursue safety. It's not anti-Semitic to say committing the exact same atrocities on a different people group. And I think that we're at to the place, I just want to give a little bit of a trigger warning with the language, like ethnic cleansing or genocide. There are countries that have gone to court to say what is happening right now violates international law. It is a humanitarian crisis. And so our imaginations are too small to think that that's the way to get to safety for this people group, is to obliterate this people group. And I can't unsee how this is precisely what we do to one another. When we don't heal our wounds, when we're unaware of the trauma or the pain of our own story, the way that it then plays out in retributive ways, and we live in reactivity. And I think that what's happening there is a microcosm of that in this moment. Sure. I would say there's a lot to excavate. Our own theological paradigms that come into this. Certainly there's history, there's political ramifications to what's happening. And I think the way of Jesus, for those of us that are Jesus followers, are invited to have imaginations for what mutuality and flourishing look like, and to reckon with the idea that that flourishing doesn't exist for me if it doesn't also exist for you. If my flourishing comes at the cost of your flourishing, that's not flourishing. And I think we in this moment and beyond have the opportunity to have a much bigger imagination for what the gospel is, and is the gospel good news, and who is it good news for? And when we look at God's original intentions for creation, for shalom, for goodness, for flourishing, for generative ways of being with one another and with the land, for reciprocitive ways, I think we have an invitation to have much bigger imaginations for restorative justice than just what is retributive. So I would say be prepared to excavate all of the dynamics that you're bringing into this moment of crisis. And I hope that the amount of the ways that we're socialized and cultured and formed, I hope that doesn't impede taking action in this moment. Yeah, that's what I want to say. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that many Christians that I was hearing from didn't understand the church's alignment with being pro-Israel, or the eschatological lens that people had on this moment. And so they were trying to understand, because there is rhetoric out there that really bastardizes and co-ops. And I think part of what hinders us entering into that conversation is our own colonized version of faith that we hold here in the West. So I had a conversation with a Bible scholar, Scott McKnight, talking about just what are some of the things that go into that reading of the text. What are some of the things that go into like rapture or replacement theology, those types of things. I have a conversation with Drew Jackson, who is like a poet, prophet, pastor, works for the Center of Action and Contemplation, and write some poetic commentaries on the book of Luke from the underside. What does this say about the kingdom of God? And I think he has a pretty profound challenge for us. I speak with the woman, Michelle Graham, who I've gone on some trips with. She did her MDiv like thesis work around the difference between geopolitical Israel and theological Israel, and talks about some of the covenants that supersede other covenants. So kind of helps us reckon with what we do with the land and who it belongs to. I talked to Jason Miller, who's a pastor and has experience on the ground, and also talks about his journey of sort of reckoning and how that shapes, what he believes, what he does in the church world. Another Bible scholar named Cody. It's not done. We're going to continue to add conversations. I've got one coming up of a mutual friend of ours who's a pastor, long time. He just retired from local church ministry, but he changed his mind on this topic while leading a congregation. And so he's just going to talk about even his own journey of discovery and exploration. So Palestinian Christians, and then Greg, that's the episode you're going to share, where I think he unpacks in a variety of ways what's happening. He was a lawyer on the ground negotiating the peace deal for Palestinians and on Gaza 20 years ago, and talks about how much this moment was not a surprise. And he's just a brilliant thinker and really challenges us in that conversation. So I'm thrilled that you're going to share that one. Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing it, Mike. I look forward to some feedback.